All right. Thank you for the invitation. I appreciate it, and I'm sorry for what I'm about to do with that invitation, which is not talk about global value chains at all. This is a very sophisticated clicker here, so it buzzes in your hand with 5 minutes to go, so I've got to use it. I brought my own version, but the World Bank's high tech. So I'm going to talk about something my co-authors on the project have not seen, and there are 3 of them in the room. So Emmanuel's in the room, Glenn's in the room, and you've seen Kalina. Andreas is not in the room, so he bears no responsibility. It is work in progress. We don't have a paper. This is not the set of facts that will turn into a paper, but it is a set of facts that we're using to try to think about what questions we should ask. And it has very little to do with global, but I'm going to make the point that if we don't understand what's going on domestically with production networks and linkages, then we're really kind of a bit blind when we think about global value chains. Because right now, we have a lot of work that's been done, a lot of innovative work at the aggregate level. And we're starting to get some work at the firm level in global value chains, starting because the data is still tough to work with. But we always kind of don't know what's going on behind the scenes because within countries we almost never get to see stuff. So I'm going to pull the curtain aside for a country that is unlike the others we've talked about because it's advanced and it's Belgium, so it's small and open. And hopefully by inundating you with facts that will stimulate you to rethink things. So global value chains raise a bunch of questions, but I do want to caution the room to not imagine that everything is different and we're in a brand new world just because we're now recognizing that value goes across borders many times between countries. So please don't make the mistake of thinking we need to throw everything out. Comparative advantage still matters. A lot of the focus is on cross-border flows, but we don't understand a lot about the firm-to-firm connections in global value chains, and we don't know much about the domestic networks. So we're going to look at the domestic production network in Belgium. Today, I'll help you understand a little bit about who's connecting with whom, what the domestic role of distance is. It still matters quite a bit, even in a country as small as Belgium. And how the domestic networks link to international trade. That's going to be fairly light because we haven't done too much of that. That's being done by other people with this data. And then I'll try to save enough time to look at the last question because that's something we know absolutely nothing about with any other data set as far as I know, which is really how these networks change over time. So I'm going to give you some facts about what's going on in the Belgian production network over a 10-year period. The data comes from VAT transactions from 2002 to 2012. An observation is a pair of firms, a selling firm I. Let me just be careful because everyone's been very careful about this. So I think the technical term is enterprise. You should think of it as a tax reporting entity, right? So single VAT number is what I mean by a firm. That's probably not exactly a firm. In the United States, GE has 33 tax reporting numbers because it has lots of divisions. So presumably that's somewhat true in Belgium. So I'm going to call them firms or enterprises. A firm I selling to a firm J a certain amount exclusive of VAT, so a certain amount of euros in a given year. So we'll aggregate all the relationships up. They report them at the aggregate level. All enterprises that have to report VAT transactions are in the initial database. All transactions annual, when I say transaction, I mean annual, of at least 250 euros. That gives us 77 million. Sorry, Swati, you don't have a lot of observations. I don't know why it would take weeks. We can run them later. Maybe we can run some of your regressions on my laptop. So 77 million enterprise-to-enterprise transactions, 300,000 selling IDs, 400,000 buying IDs. If you sell entirely to the public or to the government, you'll not be in there as a seller, but you might be in the data set as a buyer. So that helps explain why there's a difference there. We have five broad sectors, but utilities and non-market services, so far we've just included as buyers. If you think about utilities, which is a regulated industry, in Belgium, the electric utility is selling to thousands, tens of thousands of customers, and we don't really want that in there when we try to think about their connections. So we'll just have them in there as buyers because they're going to be buying stuff, services, and goods from other Belgian firms. There are lots of imperfections. It's based on the raw transactions, not the kind of final position on your VAT. So it's whatever you reported in the initial year. That means that there's some missing stuff, but it's not enough for us to worry about. We are missing 90 million transactions between folks in the database and self-employed, anyone who doesn't have to report in the VAT database. So those are going to typically be small, but you should know that that's not in there. And if you want more on this, Emmanuel and Glenn have a clear paper on how the data was constructed. We add into that a bunch of stuff, enterprise characteristics from annual accounts, normalized to make sure that they're in the same calendar year. We know the main economic activity. We don't know the multi-industry, multi-product nature of the enterprise. We have a postcode location, which I'll use in the distance. We can match in importer-exporter data. This is Belgian data. If you're not used to Belgian data, it's pretty fantastic. It's not perfect. For instance, the importer and exporter data doesn't tell us about the foreign firm. So we don't know the global firm-to-firm network of these firms. We know the domestic firm-to-firm network and then some pieces of their international orientation. And then we have some FDI stuff, which I actually have taken out of the presentation. So we count, just for those who are not that familiar with kind of the way networks get counted, we have out degrees. Degrees are, think of those as links. Out degrees would be your customers. And in degrees would be your suppliers. So the folks who are sending stuff to you, that's from your perspective, that's an inward movement, and in degree would be the count of those, and out degree would be counting the number of customers you have. So I'm going to use that language. I'll try to say customers and suppliers pretty much all the time. For those of you who are not conversant in networks, I've had to change all the stuff that Glenn produced because he uses in and out degree everywhere. So customers and suppliers, average in our data set in 2012, all this stuff for the cross-sections from 2012, nothing is substantially different in 2005 if you're worried about the recession. The median number of customers for a firm in the data set's 5. The mean is 38. There's some firms with lots of customers, one that has 41,000 odd customers. The mean number of suppliers is the median number of suppliers is higher. The mean number of suppliers is not quite as high, but firms are pretty well connected in this data set, right? There are not too many one-to-one connections in here, which makes sense. If you think about a typical firm, they're buying from lots of folks and selling to typically more than one customer. It varies across sectors. So the manufacturing, it's hard to see this, but the manufacturing sector has firms have more customers. The distribution of its out degree, its customers, is shifted to the right. And it's actually shifted a bit to the right on the supplier side, too. The manufacturing firms, that's their primary sector, they have more suppliers as well. So it's going to be important in a lot of what we do to make sure we control for industry, because there's a lot of variation across industry. And variation that I don't think we really know much about, but we're not going to explore too much today. So some non-surprising stuff. But it's important when thinking about this. If you think about the number of customers, which is on the x-axis of the top part of this graph, so more customers out to the right, fewer customers to the left, and these have all been normalized so that the relative to your 5-digit industry. And then turnover, or TFP, I could have put value added, I could have put employment or value added per worker, pretty much anything. It's positively sloped. If you have more customers, you sell more, right? If you have more customers, you also have higher TFP. No causality meant to be implied. In fact, that's kind of the key question, was which way are these things working? The same thing's true on the input side. The more suppliers you have, the greater your sales, right? Think of it the other way. The greater your sales, the more suppliers you have, the higher your productivity. The more suppliers you have, or the more suppliers, the higher your productivity. That's one of the things where this project is really going to try to focus on is, can we get nice, Swati-like exogenous shocks to, let's say, your supply base or to your customers, and then see what happens to your performance, right? So that's where we're headed with some of this stuff. One of the things, so let's just point out, more customers, more sales. So now I want to look across firms with few customers and firms with a lot of customers, and ask, what do the sales look like at different parts of your customer distribution? So this is an important picture, because this is going to rule out a lot of models of the world. And this is exactly the same picture we see in the export data from Norway in another paper with Andreas and Karna Lendl-Tvedmo. So this is your, if you have 10 customers, these are sales to your median customer, right? And it's, it's relative to your industry. This is all relative to your industry. And this is a firm that has 1,000 customers. And its median customer buys the exact same amount as the firm with 10 customers. When you get big, your sales distribution doesn't actually change. Right? The shape of that distribution in terms of the level of sales across your customers doesn't change. You get big because that distribution is getting dense. Right? There are lots and lots more firms that are buying from you out here than in here. Right? So the correlation that we saw a second ago, this positive correlation between customers and sales, is not driven because I sell more to my median firm or to my 90th percentile customer. It's driven because I have more customers. Right? And that's actually something that's going to discipline a lot of the work when we think about firm-to-firm connections. On the supplying side, it doesn't quite look like that. Actually, if you look here, the slopes are negative. So you're actually selling a little bit less. We actually find negative slopes for the Norwegian data as well. We've been taking this as flat, but the data actually says you're selling less to those guys, not more. On the purchasing side, firms that have lots of suppliers, it looks like there's dispersion going on. They're buying more from their 90th percentile supplier and less from their 10th percentile supplier, and about the same from the median. So it looks like as they get big and add more and more suppliers, they're actually skewing their purchases. So different things on the customer side and the supplier side. Who connects with whom? This is a really big deal. It's huge in global value chains, and we kind of don't talk about it except to try to figure out how to get these guys in. But this is really, what we need to think about. So in every data set that I've looked at, cross borders and within countries, within Japan and within Belgium here, we find what's known as negative degree assortivity. And it takes about 10 exposures to that phrase before you start to get a handle on it. So if it's your first 9 times, it's okay. What that means is that, I'll just tell you what the axes are here. So this is taking out industries, this is not. Here are the number of customers for any given firm, any given seller. And here are the number of suppliers to those customers. Right? So on this axis, if I'm the firm, this tells me how many customers I have. This axis tells me how many folks are those customers buying from. And there's a negative relationship. What that means is that in practice, well-connected firms are selling to everyone. They sell to other well-connected firms and less well-connected firms. Less well-connected firms, on average, are selling to well-connected folks. So on one side of the transaction, either internationally or in this case within a country, we have a firm that's very well-connected. This is actually important, again, because it rules out certain types of models that are starting to proliferate using network ideas in the trade and maybe global value chain context. Positive assortivity here would say the following. Paula has many, many more friends on Facebook than I do. Everyone I've ever done with this has claimed that, so you're in good company. I always manage to pick the person who's not on Facebook. If Paula were on Facebook, she would have many, many more friends. Those friends would also have more friends on average than my friends would. In other words, I'm not well-liked, and my friends aren't well-liked either, right? Negatives, we're all in the low end. Paula's well-liked, and her friends are well-liked. Firms and countries in trade don't display that behavior. They're negatively assortively related. Well-connected firms connect with other well-connected firms and less well-connected firms. There is, actually I'm going to skip that one. So.
Who was connected was selling to 41,000, but by the way, it's surprising. I was thinking which Belgian firm would that be. So isn't it because, on average, of course, if I'm selling to 41,000, I'll have a lot of small ones. I mean,
it's not driven. It's not driven by pure size. No, because in human social networks, you have a lot of connections, but it's sort of popular people are connected with each other, and then I'm connected with the rest of them. Right? So no, it's not driven by purely by the number of connections. Okay, so so that's a bit about who connects with whom, and something we need to think about, and we want to think about how that evolves. So let's spend a little bit of time thinking about distance, because distance is going to matter. So just first, here is the distribution of the distance of the links, and we're using the postcode to measure distance. So you can see that most connections are local, and that's true in the Japanese data as well. Actually, the connections are a little less local in Belgium than they are in Japan. The median link is 54 kilometers away. So half the links are longer than that and half are smaller for your suppliers. And for customers, it's just a little bit less. That's not random. If you take the firms and take their number of links and then randomly rewire the network to keep the number of links the same, but draw their partners sort of randomly throughout from the pool, you get longer distances. Right? So the network, the production network in Belgium, the production network in Japan, the global production network, right, are all disciplined by distance. Distance is affecting link formation, and thus, we know the extensive margins matter a lot in terms of the value that's traded. So if you think within Belgium, there's going to be a lot of value traded at short distances and less value traded at longer distances. And this is going to make sense because it's not costless to move from one part of the country to the other. And it may not be the cost of goods going, but it may be the cost of making connections and actually meeting people. That may actually be something that's harder to do if you go from the north to the south. This is the same thing, right? The number of suppliers and your median distance to your supplier is rising in the data. And in the simulated networks, redrawn networks, it's flat. The number of locations is also, the number of locations you source from is also increasing in performance characteristics, positively correlated. So your sales and the number of postcodes where you have at least one supplier are positively related. TFP is a little more wiggly, but the relationship's still positive. If we took other performance measures, they'd all be upward sloping. So better firms are sourcing at greater distances. This is linking now to the work of Andras Fort and Tintelnot, to work I've done with Andreas, where we're thinking about a bunch of the things that are going on at the firm. If you have a raw productivity draw, right, it's going to allow you potentially to source over more locations at greater distance to find better and more suppliers, which may reduce your marginal costs and allow you to reach better and more customers. Right? So these things are all kind of working together. Within firms, we have the fact that, so within a buyer, the folks who are supplying that buyer have characteristics that vary. So if you think about the variation in their, let's just go to TFP, the measured productivity of all the folks supplying a given customer, well, that's positively related within the firm to distance. So you have to take a minute to think what that means. That means if I'm a customer and I look across all the folks supplying me, the folks who are farthest away have the highest productivity. Well, that actually makes a lot of sense because it's more costly and difficult to transact at distances. This shows up again in the trade data. And so the better folks, the more connected, more productive, larger firms that I buy with will tend to be at greater distances. Because it's not as costly, right, for me to transact with Emily because she's 14 steps down the hall, right? It's much more costly for me to transact with Glenn because he's across the ocean. Nothing said about actually your quality in that example. So within firms, right, we're seeing these costs of distance mattering in terms of who you connect with. Right? If we think about the relationship between sort of well-connected and less well-connected firms, that actually goes up once we control for distance. Right? So once we control for distance, it turns out this negative assortivity is much stronger because what's happening is that at a distance, I'm just connecting with the good firms, right? So I don't connect with as many firms of low quality or connectedness, but close to me, I connect with everyone if I'm a good firm. So once we condition on distance, we get much stronger negative assortivity. Yes? Well asked. right? Now, before we do this, I have to remind you, I don't know the firm-based connectivity in the Belgian data. I know the firm connectivity internationally for a bunch of other data sets, and I don't know the domestic. So far, we haven't been able to find a data set, that puts it all together. But I'm going to tell you a bit about, just a bit, about the international. There's nothing causal in this entire talk, right? We haven't gotten there yet. I'm going to tell you a bit about the correlations between the international activities of the firm and their domestic networks.
More connected with the international buyers and sellers than their domestic counterparts.
Yeah, that's true. So just wait a second, and you'll see what facts I think we know so far. That's a true statement. Yes. But one of the questions is whether that's a substitute for domestic connectivity or not. That's kind of what we really want to know. Right? Yep. Yep.
And you're talking about distance and pure physical distance?
In that case, it was physical distance in Belgium. So.
An interesting aspect of Belgium is that cultural distance is also.
Yeah, I don't know what you're talking about. And I'm not allowed to know anything about what you're talking about.
Come on.
Yeah, but
come on. Yeah, you
so
have to do it in
so I have co-authors in the room who should cover their ears, but we're not allowed to look at that. For exactly the reason that you can imagine. So that's true. Yeah. Emmanuel, you don't talk to them. Right? Blame it on me, but we're not allowed to look at that. There are potentially ways to get around that, but the best I think we would ever do is control for it rather than try to look at the implications of that on other things. It's a sensitive topic in the data. Yeah, there's also time distance, right, which is pretty close probably to geographic distance. I thought that's what you were going to ask. But there are other distance metrics besides geography, right, that might be correlated with geography that we haven't looked at. So, I mean, Swati's just talked about a different kind of distance metric. I think it's 400 or 350, something like that. Yeah. So if there were a country where you would think that you would kind of hit the boundaries and it wouldn't really matter, I think this would be it, and it still seems to matter quite a bit. Right? You can imagine when we looked at it, in another paper we look at it in Japan, if you've ever tried to go from Hokkaido, to the south, it's really hard, right? And so, it's both longer and for any given 400 kilometers, harder to travel, for the most part. So we're still finding it in spite of the fact that it's relatively easy to.
No, but exactly you're finding for the reason you can mention, because, if you go Flemish, Wallon, I mean, you have this distance, which is the language, cultural distance, which, it's basically, I think, the reason behind why
you could, you might expect that it's affecting this distribution. I suppose we could look to see whether we think it's affecting this distribution or whether it's, again, we might be able to condition it out to make sure it's not a problem. It's not going to make any of this stuff go away, right? I mean, I'm really confident about that. Okay. Other questions before I go on? So I was exactly halfway through my talk and the time, and then you guys derailed me. That's okay. 17 minutes. Yeah, I know. Okay, the domestic networks of exporters and importers. And this is, given the topic of the gathering, going to be a little bit light, and I apologize, but we weren't redoing results in the last week. So first, something that I think many of you know, but it's worth repeating, especially given all the conversation about global value chains. So conditioning on exporting, here's the distribution of the share of domestic turnover across firms from 0 to 1. So conditioning on exporting, right? And remember, even in Belgium, not many firms as a total fraction export. You can see that the vast majority of firms, right, are selling, here's 50%. The huge majority of firms are selling more than half their output at home, even if they're an exporter. So you just need to get out of your head that this is an economy that's so open that everyone's an exporter. You can't help but be an exporter. You accidentally send stuff to the Netherlands every other day, right? That's just not the way it works. The same is true on the input side, and I think this is particularly important when we want to think about capabilities and global value chains, right? The vast majority of firms purchase, even these are conditioning on importing, can purchase more than half their inputs domestically. Now, we know there are some non-traded, essentially non-traded inputs that are in this mix, but it is just a point to remember that really open global firms are not necessarily purely open and global. Trade status is a little hard to see, but basically, I've dropped the FDI stuff from the talk just because it didn't match up exactly with on all the slides, but FDI kind of looks the same. Here are the domestic firms in terms of their distribution of the number of customers they have in Belgium. You can see that traders, importers, exporters, or in particular, the right-hand line is the guys who do both, they have more domestic customers, right? These are bigger, better firms. That's a little bit cleaner, actually, and this is important on the input side. They have more suppliers, more domestic suppliers than the purely domestic firms as well. So even, firms that are two-way trading, right, have more domestic suppliers. That could be most likely is because of underlying quality characteristics, but it's worth remembering these guys are not purely substituting. What about, how do these things co-vary? Well, controlling for sales, we find, and I've got sort of three measures here for exports and imports. The 0-1, are you an exporter, is positively related to your number of domestic customers, even controlling for your total sales. Once you condition on being an exporter, then you actually get negatives, right? So if you're you're an exporter, but you're more export intensive, you go to more destinations or have more export sales, right? And remember, we're controlling for total sales. Then you have fewer domestic customers. So it looks on the customer side like firms, once they get into exporting, actually are doing a bit of substituting. And that's something we actually haven't seen in anything that I know of before. The importer side, in terms of customers, doesn't look like that. If you're an importer, you have more domestic customers. The coefficient's actually about the same. But these are positive. So conditional on being an importer, the more you import, or the more places you source from, or the more products you source from overseas, the more you sell, the more customers you have at home. Right? So it looks like that sort of makes sense, right? If you're importing, you're potentially reaching out to more customers. On the supplier side, right, you have more domestic suppliers if you're an exporter. We've already seen that. Now we're conditioning on total sales. Export value is basically flat. The number of products or the number of destinations are actually both positively correlated. So the more heterogeneity you seem to have in both your destinations and your products, and I've suppressed the product one here, that seems to be positively related with the number of suppliers you have. And if you're an importer, you have more domestic suppliers. And if you're importing more, right, conditional on being an importer, you have more domestic suppliers, greater number. So at least at that aggregate level, right, it doesn't look like because you're importing from a lot of places or a lot of products that you're substituting away from domestic suppliers. Now, we can't, at this point, we haven't done anything to try to match industries or anything like that, but we're just sort of trying to get a feel for the data. We don't want to write down a framework, right, and we at least have one author of one of those frameworks in the room where we don't have to worry about it. We don't want to write down a framework where every time you find a foreign supplier, you drop a domestic supplier. Right? So if you think about the complementarity substitutability parameter in Paul's work, you would say, they don't talk about the domestic side because they can't see it. But here, we're kind of getting the same feel that these things look like complements. If you're able to source from more places, you source from more places or more people at home as well. Right? So think about global value chains. That seems to matter. Yes. Yeah, there are. In fact, yeah.
Are you looking at within NACE 4? What is it? Because
NACE 5, NACE Bell 5. But that's just one industry per firm. So as soon as we get into these bigger firms, then we're starting to have problems.
Are you
with
buying
that.
the same thing from?
No, I just told you I don't know that.
You don't know.
Yeah.
NACE 5.
Yeah. Okay, so unfortunately that's it for the global part of the talk. Now, the stuff that I think is actually really new, really interesting, all that other stuff you could have picked more or less from some of the international stuff that I've done and others have done. But as far as I know, no one's really thought, in comprehensive way about the evolution of these connections. Right? So we want to think about the evolution of these firm-to-firm connections. Still no causality. Don't get your hopes up. So first of all, how often are these relationships formed and broken? Right? Or how many firms are increasing the scope, the number of customers, or increasing the scope, the number of suppliers? So think about the customer side first. This is fraction of firms. 39% of the Belgian firms in any given year are increasing the number of customers they have. 36% are decreasing. Only 25% are constant. And among those, that would include guys who are both adding and dropping but keeping the same number. These are not small changes, right? The median change is adding 3 and dropping 3 for the guys who these net changes. And if anything, there's more churning on the purchasing side, right? There are more firms purchasing and changing their purchase partners and adding or decreasing them than there are changing their customers. I'm sorry, true. So these are, you think you just buy every other year from someone? I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm pretty sure that the numbers are going to go up, not down. It's not that I buy from you every other year, and that's why I'm adding and dropping. Remember, this is just a count, too. It's not actually the relationships. Right? It's just counting firms. Did you increase your number of suppliers on average? Did you decrease your number of suppliers? This is by actual transactions, by firm-to-firm links. Okay, so 56% of links for today in year T existed with the same partner in year T minus 1. That's actually way smaller than I think I thought it was going to be. That's a lot of new relationships in any given year. 44% of the relationships I have, right, are coming from either adding a relationship with a firm that existed, making a relationship with an existing with a new seller or a new buyer. Both of them new basically doesn't show up. The idea that two firms are born and then they start transacting with each other just doesn't seem to really happen in the data. It's true if you think about what's going to be dropped from the portfolio. Again, we have about 57% of relationships continuing from today to tomorrow, and most of the ones that are being dropped are with continuing firms. That's just because they're the dominant group of firms in the data. But this is a lot of churning in relationships. We don't see this much churning at the product level, right? We don't see this, when we've looked at it, we don't see this much churning in potentially in international markets, right? So the work I've done on these annual changes, firm-to-firm connections with the Norwegian data suggests that this is a larger churn, which suggests a type of cost that might be embedded there.
Yeah, it's really big. But do you know whether this is happening at the fringe? So it's very small guys that you're changing, but like your core suppliers are maintained? Something in that direction?
So I don't know if I've got it. We didn't have exactly what I want is then to redo this by value. Right. That would answer your question. We didn't quite do that. The answer is, and I don't know if I have the picture here because I can't remember this morning whether I dropped it or not. These are more important than these, but not to the extent that you might think that, okay, you've got 44% new connections, and so that's 5%, 10% of the value. It's a lot more than that, but this number in value terms is going to be higher. It's going to be in the 60s. To the extent that I did the math right. Maybe Glenn can figure it out while I'm talking. He's actually going to figure it out while I'm talking. I talked about the scope. Let's just talk about the fraction of firms that are doing any adjustment, either adding or dropping. So think about firms and whether they added a customer from T to T minus 1 to T. 71% of firms, right? Let's do it the other way. 20% of firms did no adding, right? And 21% of firms did no dropping, right? Of customers. So most firms, right? The large majority of firms are doing some kind of adding or dropping of connections between T-1 and T. And that's true, even more true on the supplier side. Right? The idea that firms have a set of links, either suppliers or customers, and they stay still, it's just not what we see in the data. We see a lot of adding, a lot of dropping. If your natural inclination, and believe me, mine is to write down models with fixed costs because they're easier to solve, this is probably not the right way to go with this data, right? It doesn't look like the fixed cost of making and breaking, of making a relationship is that high, right? Because you're willing to make and break a lot of these.
Can I?
Yeah.
Because you're making a big deal of this adding and dropping.
Yeah.
I thought you were the one where, if you think about the export dynamics literature, like all these firm entering, becoming new exporters, we know that if you're using like T plus 1 or T minus 1, you're going to think that there are a lot of new entries simply because, you may sell 1 year. There are these interruptions, this gap year. So I think it would be very important to do robustness.
So that's Swati's question, right?
A lot, because I think, the number of new entrants that you would get, they were like 70% new entrants, drops, if you start looking at 2-year, 4-year windows, you see that these are not new relationships, but just there wasn't.
Yeah, and that is, and as I said, I don't have that number for you, but I'm willing to stand here and presumably be recorded in Singapore and say that I don't think that that's what you're going to find. Okay, good. All right, so he heard that very clearly. So I'm on the record around the world as saying, I don't think what's going to happen, and the way I want to do it is in this one, that once you go to longer horizons, that the fraction of continuing relationships is actually going to rise. She's not listening, but that's okay.
No,
that's very typical. Neither my co-author and my friend here are just not listening. Right? Okay. Yeah, and right. And I have a version of that. I didn't put the slide in. There's a version, but it's not quite exactly the same. What I do know is that this number, which I can look at, rises, I think, to 67%. So weighted, these guys are bigger, but it doesn't rise to sort of 80-something%. There's a lot of value, right, in these added and dropped relationships as well. You have to remember, though, that whenever you think about these other connections that we know something about, we don't have services in there. So part of what we have to figure out is this churning really going to be driven by sectors or some other set of attributes? My guess is, though, that where we have to go with this is we have to think about the fact that these relationships don't have huge sunk cost to them, right? So that you're able to add and drop these things, or you're willing to add and drop them relatively quickly.
It will depend on the nature of the product that you're having. I mean, these guys that you're dropping and adding could be big firm buying, pens and paper, and they buy from different places.
Yeah, I guess my point is that when you look at the international data, you don't see this as much. And so there's something going on, some type of cost, some type of change in behavior. Same firms, presumably, between what they're doing domestically and internationally. And I think that's interesting, and we need to know more about that. Because that suggests if you get into an international relationship, it's less likely to go away, but it may, of course, be harder to get in. Right? So that's where I would take this. So if you put in fixed effects for the firm, these relationships between performance and number of customers and number of suppliers still hold. So it's not just being driven by cross-section stuff. This is actually my last table. I left the title in the working draft of our working document on facts, which is not the paper, because I couldn't think of something better. But basically, the way you should think about what we're reporting here is within a particular relationship, right? So this is the value of the transaction between I and J in any given year, with a fixed effect for I and J. So now we're just going to look at the variation in the I-J relationship over time. What happens, right, to the sales from I to J if I adds another customer, right? So we don't know why that's happening, right? We don't know what's driving which. But if I'm a seller and I add another customer, right, in that year, right, I increase my sales to my existing customers, right? That's what this coefficient is saying. So the more customers I have, I'm not switching away from you. we don't know that this is only for continuing relationships, so that's a big condition given all the churning I've just talked about. But the more customers I have, the more my sales go up to you. The same thing is true, and this is actually potentially more interesting, on the purchase side, right? So the sales between I and J, well, J is the destination guy. If the destination, the buyer, adds another supplier, right, they actually buy more from their existing suppliers, right? So that correlation, I think, is interesting because it's not that I'm going to buy less from you when I add another guy. On average, across firms within these relationships, the better that you're doing, the more that we're going to transact. Right? And that's something that I think is, as we think about how to model the dynamics of these relationships, we want to take that seriously. Okay, I have 1 minute left, so I'm just about right. So, a lot of facts. I'll try to summarize them, and then I'm going to tell you what I think the interesting next question is for each of the sets of facts, and some of them have already come up. So the numbers of suppliers and the number of customers are strongly correlated with firm performance, and this is not the first time we've seen this. And it's a challenge to think about the causal relationship. I've tried to write some stuff on that using Japanese data. We're going to work a lot harder on that with the Belgian data because now we have the values of the transactions as well as just whether you're connected. But which way the causality goes, and potentially can go in both directions, I think that's important to understand that. It's certainly going to be important for thinking about the links to global value chains. Distance plays a role, a strong role in the connections. And one of the questions that I have is how much of that is the importance of face-to-face, right? The fact that that distance actually inhibits face-to-face communication, maybe more than it inhibits trade of goods. And so are both the goods relationships and the services relationships disciplined by distance because of face-to-face? I don't know whether we can answer that with this current project. Trading firms have different / better domestic networks, but then we don't know which way this works. So one of the really interesting questions is if you could exogenously increase the domestic network of a set of firms, would that mean that they're more likely to participate in international trade? And the customer and supplier networks presumably might have different effects. But we really want to disentangle this because we really want to understand how much of the stuff that Kalina was talking about, let's talk about management capability, is because managers are able to put together a better set of domestic networks. I mean, the causality may run from her variable to this variable to trade. And then finally, what I emphasized at the end was this frequent breaking and formation of firm-to-firm relationships. And then a question in global value chains, is that different than other trading relationships? And is international trade different than the domestic? And then what's disciplining that? What's causing that to change? Okay, that's it.
Very good timing. So I'm sure there's lots of questions. I'm trying to refrain myself. Emmanuel, yeah.
The last table you showed, it seems a bit contradictory to the early ones that you showed on the static view, where you basically the expansion was all at the extensive margin. So you have more clients, but you sell about the same, and you show that. And this seems to be kind of the opposite.
So what I didn't do before was tell you that the same client has the same sales. If it wasn't the within firm over time, yeah. It was cross firm, right, in a market. How the within firm evolves, right? The within firm evolution is then got to be commingled with firm entry and exit as well, right, to get you that entire cross section. But if I add another customer and sell more to the existing customers, that means that my existing customer may be in a different part of the distribution, right? And if it has to hold within firms too.
Does the data allow you to look at whether the trade is going on within or outside or across the boundaries of the firm? And if so, would you think that the
trade or the...
Yeah, the transaction.
The international trade.
No, the domestic transaction, like within a business group or across, the boundaries of the...
Well,
okay.
Yeah, we got different. These are different tax identities. There could be multiple tax identities for the same what you're calling firm. Right?
Sure, but it would be interesting if within the whether the sum of these status fact would be different when you look at transactions going on within the boundaries of of the firm or within a business group, I guess. Yeah.
Well, we can talk about that later. Russ?
I'm presuming there's kind of industry fixed effects, essentially. That, I mean, if I'm buying from a firm in that industry, in the simulation, I have to buy from the firm in that industry. Right?
I'm pretty sure Glenn's going to tell me what the right answer is, but I don't think when we did that we condition on you having to reconnect with the same 5-digit industry. It's all firms. Yeah, but Russ's point is, you wouldn't want to. You might.
Question, right? In the sense that there's this question of whether distance effect exists because there's a trading cost, or whether the suppliers are near one another, and that's why distance matters, right?
Right. So if all the cotton suppliers are near the cotton producers, then even if I redraw another cotton producer, I don't get to the same random distance. Yeah, no, that's something you could easily do. Yeah, we can do that.
You could look for other co-agglomeration. Like some of these stories about co-agglomeration of firms, you could look at more.
Right. So the way I think about this, not necessarily because we've done this in this paper, is that the co-location of producers and suppliers is in many of the more sort of industry level things going to look like productive spillovers, when in fact it's not really productive spillovers, it's lower marginal costs, right? Because I can match with more guys. So how much of that is driven by the supply side, which tends to be ignored in the agglomeration literature, at least the input side does, I don't know, but I think it's definitely there for sure. Yep.
Scope of these firms, presumably, if they add customers because they add new products,
Yeah, we
able
don't.
to buy from new
So
suppliers as well.
for a subset of the firms, we could potentially link it to a different, much more limited data set and look at products, but then we'd be really not looking at the entire production network. So we don't have the answer to that because we have a single NACE 5 code for every enterprise, which is not ideal. We could look at their export products. I mean, if we wanted to get a proxy for that, but then again, that's only for the exporters, not for the domestic firms.
Yeah. So when we think about lead firms and GBCs, one of the ideas that I have in my mental furniture is that they're good at forming networks. Now, what does that mean? It could mean that they are good at forming stable networks, but I think that that's not always true. It depends on things like asset specificity and technological complexity. So if I think about Toyota being good at forming networks, then I would expect these really durable relationships, at least for major components and systems. Whereas if I think about Walmart forming networks for apparel, I would think of them maybe ruthlessly casting aside, firms that produce buttons and whatnot. And so I'm wondering if you start taking this to the sectoral level, if you're going to see some very different patterns of stability.
So certainly you want to do, given the heterogeneity in sectors, you want to do things within sectors. You'd never want to ignore that when you actually get towards trying to figure out what causes what. We do have the ability, somewhat limited, to say, for a given domestic firm in 2010, what are the attributes of its network, not just in terms of the number of suppliers, but also in the, how long it's been with those suppliers. So we could look at durability and see whether those coefficients change systematically across, service and manufacturing and things like that. That's something that we could certainly look at.
Okay, very good. So I think we can break for lunch. We resume at 2 o'clock in 1 hour. Okay. Just one thing. If you want the copy of the papers, there are memory sticks and the program outside the room by the entrance.